Hello and welcome. I'm Mitra Sorrells, and this is Short-Term Rentals 2025, Navigating the Next Phase of Growth. The short-term rental industry has been rapidly evolving and expanding. In recent years, we have seen a surge of new operators entering the market, while at the same time, there have been regulatory issues in cities around the world and shifting preferences from travelers. In the next hour, you will learn about Phocuswright's recent in-depth study of the short-term rental sector from our lead analyst on the project, Madeline List, followed by a discussion with our two guests. Becca Glenn is Director of Vacation Rental Partner Success at Expedia Group, and Nicole Rogers is General Manager of Lodging at Avalara. Welcome to all of you. Okay, so a few housekeeping notes before we begin. Everyone registered will receive a link to watch this on demand. Also, we will allow some time at the end for questions for Becca, Nicole, and Madeline. So please put those in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to as many as we can. And before I hand it over to Madeline, I wanted to briefly mention our methodology for this study, which was done last fall. Our guest data comes from an online survey of US travelers who stayed in paid short-term rentals at least once in the prior year for leisure travel. We've also compared that against data from those with no recent STR experience. We also surveyed US-based hosts, and Madeline conducted in-depth interviews with professional property managers. And now, Madeline, I know you're going to tell us more about what you learned. Becca, Nicole, and I are going to go off camera, and we will rejoin you when you are finished.
Thank you so much, Mitra. So I'm looking forward to sharing the findings from our short-term rental study with everybody here. I did want to preface this by addressing some things about how this data could apply to potential changes in the market and current events. To disclose fully, this survey data was all collected before the tariff news started to materialize into what it is. However, when we think about how some of this data might apply moving forward as the market or demand shifts, I do want to call attention to the fact that there are a lot of areas of the short-term rental market where we identified that there was already a need to really improve a lot of business practices, to think about introducing different kinds of standards, and to think about really meeting guest expectations and surpassing them and surprising and delighting people who come in. So we'll talk about some of the challenges today that are affecting the host market. We'll begin with more of the B2B side with our study of small hosts who have under 10 properties and are not professionalized property managers. And we'll call attention to the challenges, which will be important to track and to think about as things go forward. If demand does soften because of reduced spending power, because of tariffs, these business challenges that we'll call out will only be more important to pay attention to. So beginning with business goals and performances on the B2B side. One of the first things that I always like to talk about is the interesting diversification when it comes to business goals and the presence of hosts with very different ideas about what they want for the businesses, which translates to profit goal differences. This is a really distinct place where we see differences between a market like hotels versus short-term rentals. It's basically unheard of for hotels to not have a goal to churn a profit by the end of the year. And usually if they're not making a profit, it's a big business issue. However, with short-term rentals, we see that only 45% of small hosts are looking to generate a profit from the properties, and only the remainder are looking to do things like offset or subsidize their rents or mortgages or expenses, or to completely cover the mortgage or rent or expenses and not make more money on top of that. So this is important both in terms of the distinction short-term rentals have in their market with other sectors of hospitality they compete with. And also we'll point out some places where the hosts who are not trying to make a profit are actually performing differently and reacting differently to some market challenges compared to those who have really cracked down and are trying to churn money on top of it. However, regardless of what a host business goal was, when we asked about how they were tracking against their goals, it did tend to be pretty positive. 87% of hosts said that they met their profit goals that they set from their previous 12 months. And there were some groups that were more likely to agree with this and say that they were meeting their profit goals than others. Those with slightly larger portfolios of 3 properties or more said that they were more likely to be meeting their financial goals. And we also see some differences here based off of the properties that describe themselves as more luxury or upscale. There was a higher rate of hosts from the luxury and upscale property groups saying that they met their profit goals compared to the ones who self-describe themselves as mid-tier properties. We wanted to understand the challenges that hosts were facing. Now, when we had people rank their top challenges that they were dealing with, the interesting thing was that the biggest ones that came back were all really financial and cost related. The most common ones are here on the screen. 33% said that one of their biggest business challenges was the cost of property maintenance or upkeep, 27% higher costs of operation, and 25% unexpected costs incurred. So this is one of the areas that harkens back to what I mentioned before. Hosts are already really thinking about the squeeze on their profits that's happening just from inflation and the changes in demand that's happened within the US short-term rental market. This is something that we would expect would be exacerbated if spending power and demand would change because of the tariff situation. But dealing with costs with expenses is not new for this market, unfortunately, and there's really a lot of need to think about how to either increase revenue on the top end and bring in more bookings or crack down on the actual expenses of running the business. And then another big topic that's been happening in the B2B space within the US short-term rental market has been about saturation. There was a lot of demand that came in the post-pandemic years, and with low interest rates, there were many people who decided to buy in, invest in the market, get second properties that they would rent out part of the time, etc. And that led ultimately to a lot of concern about a saturation situation where there were more properties than there was truly demand. So we wanted to find out from hosts how they felt about this situation. Testing this statement, increased competition will force some short-term rentals in my destination to close within the next 12 months. So this isn't just finding out whether they believe there's saturation, but whether they believe saturation is getting to the point where they think properties are going to have to exit relatively imminently. 49% of these small hosts felt that this was true overall. But here again, there were some really interesting differences between groups on who felt that there was more exacerbated forms of saturation within the areas where they operate. And like I said before, the hosts who are not trying to make a profit with their properties, they have some different kinds of business experiences than the ones who are. So 58% of the hosts who were not profit oriented felt that they were going to see competition force properties to close within the next 12 months, compared to only 39% of those who are profit oriented. Those business goals and the way they respond with those business goals with preparing the properties and really thinking strategically about the businesses do make a difference in many ways in terms of how things are performing. And we also see some more concern from the upscale or luxury hosts on this front, with thinking that saturation is going to affect properties within the area within the next 12 months. So let's talk about regulation, which is an ongoing concern within this market. And I want to start here by actually folding in some of the consumer views on regulation here. This is very consistent with what we saw when we had conducted this study previously in 2021. So the first and most important thing I can say about regulation from the guest point of view is that nobody wants to go on vacation and feel like they're staying in a property that's operated illegally. 92% of short-term rental guests, as it describes them somewhat or well, to say it's important that any short-term rental property I'm considering complies with local laws and regulations. It's possible some of them are just concerned about the overall value of the law, but I feel that it's also likely that many people just don't want to have any disruptions when they're on any sort of holiday or vacation. Regardless, guests usually don't want to stay in properties that they worry may be illegal. There's also been a lot of buzz in the media about people cutting back from short-term rentals because of their concerns about how it might affect things like the housing market or affordability of local housing. I'll say that that part does not hold up as strongly in our data. We see that only about 10% of both people who had recent short-term rental experience and people with no recent short-term rental experience opted for a hotel stay because of concerns about effects on affordability of local housing from the short-term rental market. So even though it's been called out in media headlines, we don't see that actually reflected with the way people talk about their own historical behaviors for what they want to book. But looking at this from the host angle and how they're absorbing these types of challenges, 47% of hosts agree or strongly agree that changes in local restrictions have forced them to already have to alter their business model. So it is already affecting people. And I'll call out here as well that this survey was of hosts that were currently active in the market. When we think about how many hosts may have already been pushed out because of regulations that prevent them from operating or prevent them from churning enough revenue out in order to make the businesses viable, we might see different numbers from this. But seeing that about half of hosts already have been forced to change their business model because of regulation really shows how far-reaching some of these laws are. Things are constantly changing. They can be very dependent on the locale and the local governments and their relationships with short-term rentals. And hosts are definitely feeling it and having to respond in kind. And this also regulation also extends to various issues in the tax law. And we hear a lot in the advocacy community how important it is to make sure that taxes are being done correctly, because there's concern that if the city and the municipality doesn't see the tourist tax revenue reflected in the taxes that they're earning, they become so much less motivated to be on the side of short-term rentals. So we tested a statement within this study that was a little bit tricky because it's actually inaccurate. We tested the statement, I'm not required to collect, file, or remit taxes because my vacation rental platform does this for me. Vacation rental platforms do technically collect taxes, but there can be additional taxes and additional dues that are required on top of what Airbnb withholds, or other platforms like Vrbo. And I'm sure Nicole can tell us more about this when we get into the discussion portion. But we wanted to see how many people believed something inaccurate about the taxes that they were owed. And we found it wasn't a huge number overall. Only 35% of small hosts agreed with this false statement. However, they were much more likely to be unfamiliar with some of these tax regulations if they were fully managed by a property manager or if they were not profit oriented. We don't assume by looking at this that the property managers are misleading anybody in terms of taxing. It's possible that they're either handling it in-house and there's not a lot of transparency between the two, or the other possibility is a lot of people who are outsourcing to fully manage business structures are people who are less profit oriented and are not necessarily as involved in the day-to-day of their business. So that could also explain why some of these fully managed properties have a very different outlook when it comes to taxes. And just looking at how people are handling those taxes as well, the good news that we do see here is, even though there is some level of inaccurate understanding of what to do with taxes from the marketplace platform and how much they remit, it's rare for people to only be using that marketplace platform to collect the taxes for them. The property manager is involved in about 1/3 of cases. If a property manager is used, 42% of hosts use an accountant, 42% use tax software, and there's more usage of tax software from people who bought in the short-term rental market as investment properties. So they seem to be utilizing those kinds of tools more often if they came in as an investor versus as somebody else who's using it as a second home or inherited a property in situations like that. So pivoting for a bit, I really want to give some insight, shed some light into the guest view and how people are thinking about choosing different kinds of accommodations. As Mitra had mentioned, we conducted a survey of people who stayed in short-term rentals in their past 12 months of travel. So we also have some data that we will be comparing them to with the guests who had been leisure travelers in the past 12 months, but did not stay in short-term rentals. And we're going to see some pretty interesting differences between the two. But starting by just looking at the short-term rental guests, there's definitely a type of belief that I've heard within the industry that talks about the short-term rental guest as somebody who's cut from a completely different cloth, or somebody who's quote unquote, not a hotel guest. We've been trying to push back against this using our data to shed light on this for quite a few years, because I need to express this really strongly. Short-term rentals are not used in a vacuum, and the people who stay in short-term rentals are also staying in alternative forms of lodging, which means they are shopping for various kinds of lodging at any given point. They can be swayed by different kinds of offers, and also they're comparing their experience in short-term rentals to their other types of lodging experiences. And if it doesn't stack up, it can potentially impact their willingness to use the category again in the future. The most common alternative lodging form outside of short-term rentals that's used is going to be hotels. 68% of short-term rental guests had also had a hotel stay within their past 12 months of travel. There's a couple of unpaid forms of lodging used during leisure travel that come up within this list, and then some rare types of other lodgings used, like all-inclusive resorts or bed and breakfast or inns. And comparing categories when people shop for accommodations is really the norm. When we look at the shopping process, 82% of short-term rental guests reported that they had compared short-term rentals with hotels when they were shopping in their past experience, but also 38% of those who did not wind up staying in a short-term rental in the past 12 months compared short-term rentals and hotels also. So there's two sides of this. On the one hand, for the people who are more current short-term rental guests, you need to worry about the competitive offers that are coming their way, and really need to make sure that any short-term rental that's going to come across their screens or their feeds is going to stack up against the hotel options and is going to feel like a stronger proposition than the other hotels that are out there, because they are comparing the two for their trips. On the other hand, it also means that some of the people who don't have recent short-term rental experience are still thinking to look for the two, or are still cognizant of multiple kinds of lodging that are available for them for their trip needs. So there's potential to also win over new customers who are already engaging with short-term rental offers in the shopping experience. Another myth that we like to bust with our data is that rentals are the automatic choice when it comes to group travel. We tested the statement: when I'm traveling in a group, I only look at home or apartment or condo rental options. 67% of short-term rental guests agreed with this, compared to 40% of non-short-term rental guests. Obviously, there are many advantages with using short-term rentals for groups. I just really encourage operators or stakeholders within the industry to consider the fact that it's not necessarily a slam dunk decision. You still have to convince the guests that this is the type of accommodation they want to stay in through other aspects: price, value, quality, comfort, etc. And don't think that you have this automatic slam dunk for group travel. Then some other interesting things about the properties and the competitive perceptions that we want to point out are coming in our data. So this is a statement that we tested both in the 2024 study as well as back in 2021 when we ran a similar project. And we really found that short-term rental guests have a strong preference for properties that have interesting looks and feels. When it's something that's available to them, the overwhelming majority find this to be a really compelling offer and proposition from a property. However, what was interesting was that when we looked at this from the host side, from the B2B side, to see how they were responding to this guest need, we found that operators were very aware of that type of demand, and the fact that guests really prefer types of properties that feel unique and feel that they're decorated in an interesting way. However, only 19% of those small hosts report that unique look and feel was one of their top competitive features. So really a huge gap here with meeting this kind of guest need. And this is one thing that we call out, in part because it's become something of a topic of interest among the mainstream media. Even SNL did a recent skit about generically decorated Airbnbs, or there's known to be certain short-term rentals that feel like they're decorated straight out of a Home Goods. We definitely see the luxury market stepping up more, hiring more decorators and really putting their look and feel forward. But so important to understand here that there's this disconnect where hosts know that these properties are doing better, but are not necessarily investing within their own properties in a way that can meet demand. Another issue that we were cognizant of with this study was some of the negative PR around short-term rentals and the effects that that might have on hosts or guests. So we tested statements both with guests as well as hosts to kind of understand how some of the publicity was affecting them. This one, stories about negative experiences in short-term rentals have affected my likelihood to choose a rental over a hotel. Interestingly, got similar levels of agreement from both people with and without recent short-term rental experience. So it's still a concern from both sides, whether they had more recent short-term rental experiences or not. That publicity is still affecting about 59% of short-term rental guests and 65% of people with no recent experience. And interestingly, we see that it affects young people more. It's not 100% clear why this is happening, that younger people might be more susceptible to some of the negative publicity that happened around short-term rentals and things about either properties not being listed transparently, longer chore lists, etc. It's possible that it's because of social media. It's also possible that it's something like something connected with changes in the market. The people who are 55 plus might remember the last generation of short-term rentals that had a different standard that often might not have included things like sheets, toilet paper, etc. And so they might have a different standard that they're comparing against. However, we do see that hosts are pretty recognizing on a similar level in terms of the effects that some of the negative publicity has had on the market. 65% of hosts agreed or strongly agreed that unprofessional behavior from some hosts has affected travelers' willingness to consider rentals for future stays. So the hosts are not fully disconnected from this either. Of course, we would like to see more recognition about how important it is to elevate the standards of the properties, but they seem to know at a similar level to guests how important this is. And there is some evidence that hosts are recognizing the changes that guests have made. Operators are cognizant of rising guest expectations that seem to inch closer to hotel standards. Property managers in interviews also really echoed that they saw people comparing the short-term rental standards more and more to hotels in terms of the quality of the properties and the way they want properties to look and feel, and expectations around things like transparency and cleanliness. But 60% of hosts agreed or strongly agreed that short-term rental guests are more demanding now than they used to be. It wasn't something that was cited a lot as one of the primary business challenges, because as we noted, the primary business challenges they're dealing with really have to deal with costs, but about 1 in 5 hosts still did cite different guest expectations of rentals as one of their major business challenges. One thing that we want to call out when we look at the future and how things might be moving forward is that we see some evidence from the data that FCR perceptions are slipping among guests who are younger. So we had a question within the survey where we asked people from their personal experience to rate which category they felt performed better across various aspects of the booking and stay experience. They could choose hotels, short-term rentals, or no difference. So on the left, we showed how they felt about impressions of delivering value for the money by age. And this one is super important because so many short-term rental operators feel that they're very strong in this area, especially because there tends to be more square footage, there tends to be multiple bedrooms, there tends to be access to private spaces with short-term rentals. So they're very proud of the value that they offer for the money. And it's something that if operators are proud of it and they're pushing it, we want to see if the guests tend to agree with that as well. And we find that the guests who are ages 55 plus do tend to feel like short-term rentals are really the winner in that category. But we really see that the 18 to 34-year-olds are much more split in this area. And as they age, they're going to become more financially a bigger part of the traveling market. It's really important to address these things and address these perceptions while people are still young, because as they mature, they're also going to mature financially. And you really want the perceptions of short-term rentals to remain positive there, or you might see bookings sway towards other types of categories of lodging. We saw similar trends overall in terms of impressions of who delivered the best overall stay. However, this tended to lean towards hotels with the 18 to 34-year-olds. So another cause to just really focus in on this group and make sure they're having positive experiences and that their perceptions are really being lifted overall. Here, I've called out some of the things that short-term rentals are seen to be advantageous for overall. It's so important to understand what guests feel the category does better and what guests feel that the category needs to work on, because that's going to affect what they turn to for any given trip to book and their willingness to book the category for any given trip. So some of the areas where short-term rentals tend to have the edge are food prep areas. That's an easy win for them because they're so much more likely to have things like kitchens. But short-term rentals are also often considered to be the stronger category for aspects like privacy, value for the money, for having an experience that feels personalized, not generic compared to a hotel, and also can be really strong in design as well when things are executed well. However, when we look at where hotels seem to have the edge, there are quite a few categories where things lean towards hotels in terms instead of leaning towards short-term rentals. And I actually had to take some of the areas where hotels leaned stronger out of this chart because it was too overwhelming to actually show everything. I would say overall there are a couple of themes in terms of where people think hotels do better. Part of it has to do with customer service, these aspects like attentiveness, professionalism, resolving issues. Part of it has to do with other issues about aspects that you can book of aspects of the trip that you can book outside of the core lodging proposition. So things like tours and activities, things like transportation, things like food and beverage options on or near the property, hotels are seen to be better at. And then a couple other important things that come up here are like listing accuracy and safety. So these are some areas where we do see that short-term rentals could really benefit from thinking about elevating not only the actual product they're offering, but also thinking about how to elevate the reputation as well of the category, because in many aspects the strengths are leaning towards hotels. We might see people decide to book those instead for trips where they do have more needs in the customer service area, or they do plan to book other things outside of the core lodging bookings. But to end, I want to call out some of the top reasons why people are choosing short-term rentals, because it's so important to be cognizant of this as well and make sure that these things are really being pushed and emphasized in terms of listings and in terms of how the properties are being handled. So the top one was more room or space. People want the elbow room, and that also connects to the icon right below it. People want multiple bedrooms, especially when traveling with somewhat larger parties. That becomes extra relevant. The second most common reason for choosing a short-term rental over another category of lodging was value for the money. So again, there are certainly many people who see short-term rentals as the category who offers the better value. It's just really key to be aware of the fact that younger people might not see the category as strongly there. So thinking about how to boost the perceptions of the value for the money among those 18 to 34-year-olds is incredibly key. Other important ones that come up here are full kitchen and laundry, the location of the property itself, as well as things feeling like home. So I cannot express enough how much more data there is where this came from. This is truly just a teaser of what is there and what we collected from the study. We have 3 reports available in a series that are currently either available as part of the open access subscription if you're an open access subscriber, or they're available for purchase. You can scan the QR code to learn more. And with this, I also want to invite back the other speakers here.
Yeah, wow, Madeline, that was really fantastic. So much useful information there. And I know, as you said, you're just kind of touching the tip of the iceberg. So hopefully folks might be inclined to want to understand more. Great to have now Becca and Nicole joining us again. Becca, just as a reminder, is Director of Vacation Rental Partner Success at Expedia Group, and Nicole Rogers is General Manager of Lodging at Avalara. So great to see both of you. I'm very curious to just start off by asking both of you, what aspects of that data do you find most interesting? And I think, particularly since you're coming at this from kind of different angles, I'm curious to hear what stands out to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I can jump in and thank you and hello, everybody. I think for me, it is the continuous increase that we see in travelers cross-shopping between hotels and short-term rentals. Madeline touched on that. I think there probably was a time in the past where there were hotel travelers and there were short-term rental travelers, and that is definitely no longer the case. I think we've talked about short-term rentals as being this alternative lodging, and it's no longer really alternative. It's much more mainstream. And we actually are seeing this aligns with what we see within our business, where we're seeing more and more travelers who were historically hotel bookers on Expedia or hotels.com be net new travelers to Vrbo and booking vacation rentals. But to see that number of cross shoppers over 80% is really telling. And I think this is the good thing about this is the pie of travelers for this segment just continues to get bigger. Of course, the challenge here is that the expectations are changing and evolving and increasing. And the study really called that out. So more and more people want the uniqueness and the value of a short-term rental, but they expect the consistency and the service of a hotel.
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, I'm guessing if the four of us were talking, we would probably say we look at both depending on our case as well. So interesting.
Yeah, it's really based on kind of the trip that you're taking, not that you are one or the other, right? Yeah.
I'm a proud hybrid user.
I think from my perspective, what jumped out to me was really a couple of things. The top 3 business challenges are cost related. And yet less than half of those surveyed are focused on profit. So it tells me that folks are in this for the long haul, but unexpected costs are an issue for everyone, not just, the 47% or so that are seeking to make a profit. And from Avalara's perspective, it's really like tax compliance should never be an optional operational expense, right? So for me, it really kind of brings home the fact that these businesses, be it, a small property manager, a large scale property manager, or an individual owner with a couple of properties, you've got to really kind of understand the compliance landscape, because the costs associated with an audit are real, right? They can be quite painful. Secondly, I was really, the thing that Madeline called out about the survey respondents, I think roughly a third or 30 to 40% believing that the rental platforms are actually bearing the burden and actually remitting on their behalf. With little exception, that's simply not a true statement, right? And yet a pretty sizable portion of folks responded that they believe that. And we talk a lot about, locations like Myrtle Beach, where they have, 7 different layers of taxation. In that example, Airbnb and Vrbo might remit 10%, but the host or the property manager is responsible for the remaining amount. So again, if not done correctly, these types of attention to detail items can trigger really expensive audits. And then lastly, I think that hotels are really still in the mix here. Lines are blurring, and the opportunities for both short-term and hotel to plan this space continues to be very real.
Yeah. Yeah. Moving on, Becca, maybe a question to start for you. In light of the current macroeconomic challenges, what advice are you giving to property managers and hosts to optimize their businesses and really set themselves up for success?
Yeah, I would say in this environment, pay really close attention to your booking window and rate strategy. What we have been seeing, the trend this year, is a clear shift to shorter booking windows than what has traditionally been seen in this segment, and an increase in price sensitivity. So people still want to travel, and every indication seems to say that people are going to continue to travel. But, because of all of the uncertainty, they're waiting a little bit longer to book. And they're definitely more sensitive to high rates and especially high fees. So the advice that we are giving is, be open to adjusting your rates and your flexibility to sort of accommodate this shift that travelers are having right now with the uncertainty. And definitely that includes being more flexible in cancellation policies.
Okay. Nicole, anything that maybe you'd want to add there as far as the current environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think anytime there might be a slight dip in demand, jurisdictions tend to have a bit more time on their hands to focus on who's producing in their in their city, county, or state. So
Yeah.
I think from our perspective, we encourage folks to stay closely involved with, their local communities and really understand what issues are being raised at the city and county levels before they get proposed as potential legislation.
Yeah.
That, at the STR community just requires unique mobilization efforts, and it's a little more grassroots in nature, but as a good friend of mine and colleague, Scott Leggett, says, if you don't have a seat at the table, you can bet you're on the menu. So um, just be a part of that process and a part of the community.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and actually that leads into my next question nicely, which is, of course, we've seen many examples around the world of regulatory issues for the short-term rental industry. What challenges does this create for hosts? And I know you've shared some advice there, but any other advice, Nicole, if you want to start us off, that you might have?
Yeah, I mean, aside from being part of a good community, I think it is really, some of these are no-brainers, right? Being a good neighbor, abiding by nuisance obligations and enforcing them, complying with laws and HOA rules. And, obviously, part of compliance is paying taxes, but engage with your local STR advocacy groups. There's a lot of stuff changing right now. And again, when you have 13,000 jurisdictions, there's no uniformity. So get familiar with the legal processes in your community. Talk to policymakers and make your presence known, your value known. Be part of the conversation. And yeah, there's a long list of changes afoot. We keep track of that on our blog. So there's just a lot of proliferation of new taxes coming into play, new enforcement trends with AI and technology that's used to scrape listings off of Vrbo and Airbnb to alert jurisdictions to new listings. So just keep your eye on the ball. And I think from a regulatory perspective, things are going to continue to be busy, right? There's always going to be new tax changes, new obligations for both OTAs and the marketplaces and in terms of their collection requirements, and then also the STRs and the owners themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, your comment about AI, it's friend and foe, right? Depending on how it's being used. Yeah, for sure. Becca, obviously in your role as Director of Vacation Rental Partner Success, I'm sure this regulatory topics are top of mind for you as well. Tell us a little bit about any advice you might have.
Yeah, absolutely. It is definitely top of mind all the time. And I would say I would just double down on kind of the themes that have already been shared, which is stay educated. We partner with an amazing company called Rent Responsibly. They do a lot of work to make sure that the hosts and property managers are educated on the landscape of regulation. So definitely stay educated. And then more than anything, again, get involved locally, stay active at the local level. A lot of people ask me, and our team, like, what is Vrbo doing to help combat unfair regulations? And the truth is, we have a dedicated team of government affairs policy experts who work directly with state and local governments to advocate for fair regulations. But honestly, it's not the big brands like Vrbo and Airbnb that you want showing up to these discussions and advocating for your business. It's the local businesses themselves. It's the local owners and the local hosts who are always going to have the biggest impact. So we always want to do what we can to empower the local hosts and owners and property managers to do this, but the message is so much stronger when it comes from you directly. So that's why we always advocate stay involved locally.
Okay. One of the things certainly that came through in Madeline's research is a desire for more transparency, more consistency that guests are seeking in the short-term rental industry for properties. But there's also, of course, as we know, a lot of fragmentation across the industry. I'm wondering, both of you really, if you want to chime in on this, how does that issue of fragmentation then factor into or conflict with this need to create more consistency?
Yeah, it's a tricky one for sure. I think the tension definitely exists between kind of maintaining that unique experience that people want from an STR stay, while not sort of sacrificing the desire for the travelers to have a consistent experience that drives trust for this segment, especially, with all that we've talked about with the changing expectations. I do think it can exist, though. I think one of the biggest obstacles is with transparent pricing. So travelers are most concerned with the total price that they pay for their stay, and not having too many fees, especially fees that travelers don't understand. If you're listing out fees that are unclear, that's a big deterrent, and that erodes that trust. So I think limiting fees by rolling any truly necessary costs into your rate, or just at least limiting to what you list out, things that are really clear, like cleaning fees. People understand that. That is very clear. I think that is definitely helpful. The other, I think, is with listing accuracy. It was actually called out in this study that over 40% of STR guests, and that's STR guests, believe that hotels have better listing accuracy. That was a big red flag when I saw that. But it also resonates. I mean, what we see oftentimes with our partners is not so much a misrepresentation, but just a lack of details. Things like listing out all of the amenities, complete detail on location, parking information, really good pictures, a lot of pictures. Something as simple as ensuring you have all of your amenities listed and your pictures are current can make a really huge difference.
Okay. Nicole, anything that you might want to add there as far as the fragmentation and the challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I think, some of these jug fee laws that are going into effect in some states they're good for consumers, right? They're the right thing in the market. And I mean, I've seen pricing is such a big topic for the platforms, for property managers. You know, there's a lot of interesting dynamics that go on with pricing. And so I think a level of transparency with pricing is a very good thing for the market. And I think, a healthy, diverse market shouldn't equate to one without, good standards and transparency. So even now what we're seeing with, traditional hotel brands playing in the STR space, with Accor and Marriott Homes and Villas, they're established brands, and they're now moving into this category quite aggressively with their curated supply, imposing, I think, their own imprint on quality. And I think it's good to raise the bar across the board. So I think uniqueness, predictability, for consumers shouldn't come at the cost of those two things.
Yeah,
sure.
I'll add to that along the same lines as what Nicole is saying, is that it is good to be fragmented and to be unique in terms of how a property looks and feels, in terms of having an approach that's super interesting, in terms of having a cool story behind the property, behind the business. You don't want to be too unique in your standards about cleanliness. You don't want to be too unique in your standards about whether the property is as advertised when people show up. And in customer service, you only want to be unique in the fact that you're going more above and beyond for the guests, right? This is hospitality. It's about making sure that people are really happy with the experience. So I think that it can be a really good thing to have a lot of operators in the mix, in the sense that there are so many cool, interesting, really exciting properties that have come to the market since short-term rentals have become such a stronger sector in the hospitality market. But there are some areas where we just don't want uniqueness to typify the market with things like how clean a property is. So just focus the uniqueness on the right aspects of the stay.
Yeah, there's a saying that we use here a lot, which is like yesterday's luxury is today's expectation. And I think that really stands true. Yeah, we use that a lot because it really stands true in this segment. What may have made you stand out or been like, maybe you were over exceeding expectations because you had this in today's world, things like, listing out your cleanliness and having cleanliness standards, and even just things like, really good Wi-Fi and working areas. Those are no longer wow factors. That is just expectations. And so I think that is something that we really have to be cognizant of today.
White sheets, I'll die on that hill. The short-term rental need to accept the fact that white sheets are the hospitality standard.
Okay, and as we are starting to wrap up, I guess a final question that I would love to get input, certainly from Becca, Nicole, and Madeline, if you want to jump in. And Nicole, maybe we'll start with you. I'm curious, What are some examples of best practices that you have seen with some of your partners, or really any that you'd want to share?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Avalara's lodging business serves both the STR community, the hosts and owners, property managers, and also the world's largest platforms that distribute their inventory. So we're kind of in this interesting position to comment on what we see on both sides. Everyone's seeking less friction, more clarity and an aim toward really making it easier to be compliant, and optimize around the consumer. The bulk of the industry wants to make all of this work well, and they want it to be fair, when you think of like hotels versus STRs. So I think at the end of the day, there's just a concerted effort by many large platforms on both the OTA side and the STR side to engage with jurisdictions to drive toward a more equitable, easier, efficient way to achieve compliance.
Yeah. Becca?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think we've talked today about a lot of best practices around transparent pricing and ensuring your listing accuracy. One more that I will add here is don't underestimate the value of local touch. I think this is something that can continue to drive that uniqueness for the STR segment. It was actually called out in the study that I think it was 57% of STR guests prefer to go to a new destination than return to one that they have been to in the past. And I think that really gives hosts and property managers a very unique opportunity to wow with offering local expertise. Maybe it's recommendations to local restaurants and activities. I've even seen hosts place local products in their homes as a welcome gift. So these little touches like this go a long way to kind of preserving that local and new experience flair that kind of helps compete with hotels. And it also helps with that sort of customer service angle. Obviously, customer service is going to really come down to like communication time and accuracy of your listing and cleanliness of your property. But also those little touches like that, something as simple as just having local recommendations or a local little, tchotchke in the rental property also goes a really long way.
Yeah. And I guess, Madeline, I'd ask you, other than the white sheets, what else might you say?
Well, other than the white sheets, I think that on a broader level, I would say that no matter how big or small a business is, and no matter what the profit or the revenue goals are, to really keep in mind from an identity perspective that if you're running a short-term rental, you're running a business and you're in the hospitality industry, and those principles of the hospitality industry need to really guide the decisions that are being made. There was a time when it really felt like some people were kind of doing this as a side hustle, or they were almost doing guests a favor by opening up a home to stay in as opposed to making people stay in a hotel. We're past the point in terms of early adoption to justify that, and we're past the point in terms of ADRs and the prices that people are paying to justify that. So everybody really needs to hold themselves to a standard where they understand no matter how much money you're looking to make for the year, no matter what kind of occupancy you're looking for, you're a business in the hospitality industry, and those need to be your guiding standards.
Yeah. Oh, super, super helpful information. We are unfortunately out of time, but I want to thank you, Madeline, for sharing all of that great data and your detailed presentation, and Becca and Nicole for offering your perspectives and expertise. And if we can maybe get that slide back up with the QR code, I just want to mention again, please feel free to scan this code. It's going to be there in just a second. There you go. Scan that QR code if you would like to access the full 3-part study that Madeline has done on the short-term rental sector. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.